The story of Augustus begins not with the image of a towering emperor, but with a fragile young man named Gaius Octavius, born into a respectable but not dazzlingly powerful family. Few would have guessed that this quiet, often sickly boy would one day rebuild Rome. His great-uncle Julius Caesar saw a spark in him, a certain steadiness in his gaze, and decided to bet on the boy's potential. It wasn't strength of arms or the roar of a battlefield that set Octavius apart. It was patience, intelligence, and a talent for waiting for the right moment. Rome was drowning in bloodshed after decades of civil war, and the empire didn't need another reckless general. It needed a survivor who could weave order out of chaos. Caesar's decision to adopt Octavius as his heir was not just political. It was visionary. He was placing Rome's fate into the hands of a teenager many dismissed as fragile. But destiny has a way of siding with those underestimated. When Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, the city of Rome convulsed in chaos. Knives had silenced the most powerful men in the Republic, but the conspirators had no plan for what came after. Into this vacuum stepped Octavius, a 19-year-old suddenly thrust into the storm. He could have hidden, retreated to the countryside, and lived out his life in safety. Instead, he sailed directly into danger, presenting himself as Caesar's rightful heir. Many laughed at the audacity of a youth challenging seasoned generals and cunning senators. But Octavius was already playing a different game. He didn't roar with threats. He whispered alliances. He didn't chase battles blindly. He calculated them. Rome was broken, and where others saw an opportunity to grab power, Octavius saw an opportunity to rebuild it under his terms. The streets of Rome pulsed with uncertainty as Octavius aligned himself with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus to form the Second. This uneasy alliance was born not out of trust, but necessity. Rome's enemies were too many, its wounds too deep. Together, they promised vengeance for Caesar's deaths and retribution against the assassins who had thought themselves saviors. The prescriptions that followed were brutal lists of enemies nailed to the forum walls, names marked for death. Blood once again soaked the city, but Octavius understood something Antony never did. Fear could be temporary, but order had to be permanent. Every step he took during this time was a rehearsal for the empire he would eventually build. He was cold when he needed to be, soft when it mattered, and always calculating. Rome's republic was collapsing, but from its ashes, something larger was beginning to stir. The Battle of Philippi became the crucible that tested this fragile alliance. Facing the armies of Brutus and Cassius, the so-called liberators, Rome once again became the stage for Romans killing Romans. Antony shone as the fiery general, charging with charisma and brute force, while Octavius played his quieter role, observing, learning, and adapting. In the end, the assassins were crushed, and the Republic gasped its last breath. Yet even in victory, cracks between Antony and Octavius widened. Rome was not built for equals. It demanded one master. Octavius, still underestimated by many, simply waited. He let Antony shine, let him draw the spotlight, and then slowly began to build networks of loyalty, weaving senators, soldiers, and citizens into his orbit. The boy who seemed frail was learning to wield time as his greatest weapon. As Rome divided the spoils of war, Antony claimed the east, Lepidus the shadows, and Octavius the west. But while Antony dazzled with his affair with Cleopatra, Octavius stayed home, strengthening his ties with Rome's beating heart. He knew power wasn't just in swords or gold. It was in perception. While Antony appeared distracted, Octavius projected an image of discipline, order, and Roman tradition. He portrayed himself as the guardian of Rome's values, while Antony looked increasingly foreign and decadent. This battle wasn't just fought with legions, it was fought with symbols, and Octavius understood symbols better than anyone. He wasn't merely fighting Antony, he was quietly shaping himself as the only true Roman leader. When Antony flaunted his eastern wealth and Cleopatra's allure, Romans whispered a betrayal. Could Antony still be trusted as a Roman, or was he surrendering himself to Egypt's temptations? Octavius seized the narrative, masterfully painting Antony not as a rival general, but as a traitor to Rome. Propaganda flowed like blood, coins minted with messages, speeches delivered to stir fear and pride. Rome was reminded that it did not need another Caesar, it needed a protector. Octavius didn't simply confront Antony on the battlefield. He destroyed him in the hearts of the Roman people first. By the time their final confrontation loomed, Antony had already lost the war of perception. The climactic showdown at Actium in 31 BCE was more than a battle. It was destiny in motion. Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavius's fleet, a clash not just of armies, but of ideologies. Too many. It was the East against the West, luxury against discipline, passion against patience. The winds favored Octavius, but so did strategy. While Antony chased grandeur, Octavius played the long game, ensuring his supply lines, positioning his fleet, and waiting for the perfect strike. When victory came, it wasn't just military, it was total. Antony and Cleopatra's deaths marked the end of an age, the end of rivals, and the beginning of something Rome had never truly seen before. One man standing as sole ruler. With Antony gone, Octavius returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a savior. He did not march in declaring himself king, for Romans loathed the very word. Instead, he presented himself as princeps, the first citizen, a man serving the republic even as he dismantled it. His genius was subtlety, offering the appearance of republican values while centralizing absolute power. Senators, weary of chaos, handed him authority willingly. The people, exhausted from generations of civil war, cheered him as the bringer of peace. This peace, the Pax Romana, was not born of compromise, but of clever illusion. Rome still thought itself free, but Augustus had wrapped freedom in golden chains. Octavius became Augustus, a name shimmering with divine resonance. The Senate awarded him titles, honors, and symbols of godlike authority, but he wore them with the practiced humility of a master illusionist. He rebuilt temples, funded games, restored Rome's crumbling infrastructure, and wrapped his image in that of a pious restorer of tradition. But beneath this careful theater was ruthless control of the legions, the treasury, and the narrative itself. Augustus didn't just rule, he rewrote what it meant to be Roman. In him, Rome saw not just a man, but an eternal figure, the architect of stability after centuries of chaos. And so began the empire, not announced with fanfare, but whispered into existence through patience, calculation, and relentless vision. Augustus had risen from frailty to become Rome's anchor, not by pretending to be a god of war, but by mastering the art of survival and the politics of perception. His reign promised peace, but it was a peace paid for by the surrender of republican freedom. To Augustus, eternity was not built on battles. Alone, it was built on order, illusion, and the careful crafting of legacy. Rome would never be the same again. Augustus understood better than anyone that Rome was not just bricks and marble. It was an idea. To secure his rule, he needed to transform that idea into something eternal. He poured resources into rebuilding the city, turning a dusty republic scarred by civil war into a gleaming capital of empire. Temples were restored, aqueducts extended, forums filled with marble. The man who had once been dismissed as frail and unimpressive now reshaped Rome's very landscape to mirror his permanence. But Augustus was too clever to boast that he ruled by fear or conquest. Instead, he framed his works as gifts to the people, tributes to the gods, symbols of Rome's greatness. Every stone carried his shadow. Every street whispered his name. He was turning himself into the architect, not only of buildings, but of Rome's soul. At the heart of his reforms lay an obsession with stability. Augustus knew chaos had broken the republic, so he created institutions that would prevent the same collapse. He carefully balanced powers. Senators kept their prestige, but only at his mercy. Magistrates retained their offices, but under his watch. Even the army, once loyal only to ambitious generals, was now restructured with fixed terms of service and pensions guaranteed by Augustus himself. Loyalty was bought not only with promises, but with trust in his system. By making soldiers dependent on him for their futures, Augustus transformed their allegiance from fleeting to eternal. What he built was not a dictatorship in name, but a monarchy in all but disguise, cloaked in the language of the Republic. Religion became another of Augustus's tools. He presented himself not just as a ruler, but as a restorer of Roman piety. Old temples were revived, ancient rituals renewed, and forgotten gods honored once more. In the eyes of the people, Augustus was not merely a man of politics, but a man of destiny, chosen by the divine to heal Rome's fractured spirit. He positioned himself as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, merging political authority with spiritual guidance. By doing so, he didn't simply demand loyalty, he inspired faith. Romans believed their empire now stood under the favor of the gods, embodied in the figure of Augustus. This blending of religion and politics was not innovation. It was genius binding Rome's eternal identity to one man's vision. Propaganda flowed through every channel of Roman life. Coins minted with Augustus's image circulated in every hand, turning commerce into worship. Monuments carved his victories into stone, creating history not as it was, but as he wanted it remembered. Poets like Virgil and Horace sang of his reign as the dawn of a golden age, weaving myths with reality until the two became inseparable. In classrooms and marketplaces, in theaters, Rome breathed Augustus's narrative. He was not simply building an empire, he was building memory itself. When a farmer in Gaul held a coin, when a child in Hispania recited poetry, when a priest in Asia Minor invoked Roman gods, te weary all, consciously or not, repeating the gospel of Augustus, he turned politics into storytelling, and storytelling into immortality. Augustus also knew that peace was fragile if prosperity didn't follow. The Pax Romana wasn't only about silencing wars, it was about feeding bellies and filling markets. He reformed the grain supply, ensuring the city's vast population would never starve again. Trade routes flourished across the Mediterranean, guided by Roman fleets that patrolled like watchful shepherds over their flock. Provinces once restless, under the lash of Roman greed, now saw themselves integrated into a system of order and opportunity. For the first time in generations, families could plan for the future without fearing war would rip it away. Augustus understood that loyalty could not be demanded, it had to be nourished. Rome's prosperity became the most convincing proof that his rule was not tyranny, but salvation. The army, though restructured, was never neglected. Augustus realized Rome's peace depended on disciplined force, ready to strike when challenged. He built permanent legions stationed across the frontiers, ensuring enemies understood Rome's reach was endless. Roads stretched across mountains and deserts, carrying soldiers swiftly to troubled zones. Military camps became seeds of Romanization, spreading language, law, and culture wherever legions marched. Yet Augustus avoided reckless campaigns, preferring consolidation over endless conquest. He was not like Alexander, chasing distant horizons. He was a builder who valued endurance of a spectacle. Every legion, every fortress, every road was another brick in the architecture of eternity. But Augustus did not rule as a remote tyrant. He carefully cultivated his public image, presenting himself as both approachable and untouchable. Statues showed him eternally youthful, strong, and serene, defying the passage of time. Yet in ceremonies, he walked humbly, calling himself merely the first citizen. This duality, mortal servant and divine leader, was the genius of Augustus's persona. People did not resent his power because they felt included in it. He was not ruling above them, he was ruling with them, or so they believed. And belief, Augustus understood, was stronger than law. By blending humility with majesty, he created an image impossible to challenge. Even succession was part of his plan for eternity. Augustus had seen Rome torn apart by uncertainty whenever leadership faltered, so he meticulously prepared for the future. Though he had no natural sons, he positioned heirs, trained them, and groomed them before the eyes of the people. The process was not smoothed. Betrayal and intrigue haunted his household, but Augustus never wavered. He knew Rome's survival required continuity. By placing the empire above personal bloodline, he ensured that Rome itself, not just his family, would carry on his legacy. The genius of Augustus was not that he lived forever, but that he designed Rome to live forever without him. Yet behind this carefully crafted eternity lay darker truths. Augustus's reign was not built on pure benevolence. It rested on silent repression. Dissenters were silenced, Opposition crushed quietly before it could stir into rebellion. The illusion of the Republic was maintained, but its spirit was buried beneath the marble Augustus. Senators still gathered, but their debates were hollow. Laws still passed, but their weight came from one man. Rome's liberty had been traded for security, and most citizens gladly accepted the bargain. Augustus understood the timeless truth. People prefer safety to freedom when chaos has burned them long enough. He turned that truth into empire. By the time his reign stretched into decades, Augustus had become something more than human in the Roman imagination. He was the anchor, the father, the eternal presence that bound Rome together. Generations who had never known the Republic grew up thinking his rule was the natural order of things. The name Augustus was no longer just a man. It was an era. He had reshaped time itself, carving out a golden age in history's memory. Rome, once crumbling from civil wars, now seemed indestructible, and that was his greatest triumph. He convinced the world that Rome's eternity had begun with him. Augustus's brilliance was not only in rebuilding Rome, but in reshaping its culture. He knew art was power, and he used it as skillfully as any legion. Writers like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid weren't just entertainers, they became voices of Rome's destiny. Virgil's Aeneid painted Augustus's reign as the fulfillment of a divine prophecy, tying him to Rome's mythical founder, Aeneas. This wasn't simply poetry. It was propaganda, in verse. By making his rule feel like the natural continuation of fate, Augustus erased doubts. The pen became as mighty as the sword, and Rome's golden age was written in stanzas that outlived marble. Public entertainment also flourished under Augustus. He understood Romans loved spectacle, but he gave it structure. Theaters and arenas became tools to distract, unify, and control the mass. Gladiator games reminded citizens of Rome's might. Chariot races found them in shared excitement, and festivals tied entertainment to religious devotion. Augustus knew bread and circuses weren't shallow bribes, they were psychological architecture. People who laughed, cheered, and celebrated were less likely to revolt. Behind the roaring crowds, he tightened his grip on politics, knowing joy could be a leash as strong as fear. Family life became another area he reached. Augustus launched moral reforms that encouraged marriage, childbearing, and traditional values. Adultery was punished harshly, even when committed by his own daughter Julia. By making morality a matter of state, Augustus didn't just regulate behavior, he molded identity. Citizens were reminded daily that their personal lives were part of Rome's strength. In reality, these laws were less about purity and more about stability. Augustus saw families as the foundation of empire. If households were strong, Rome was strong. His message was clear. Loyalty began at home. The provinces also felt Augustus's touch. Instead of ruling them with iron fists, he offered order and inclusion. Local elites were welcomed into Roman administration, given honors and responsibilities that made them loyal to Augustus's Rome. Roads, aqueducts, and forums stretched into distant lands, making the empire feel less like foreign occupation and more like partnership. Taxes became predictable, not predatory. For many, Roman rule under Augustus felt less like tyranny and more like opportunity. It was a masterstroke. By treating conquered people as stakeholders, he made rebellion unappealing. Stability spread not just through power, but through pragmatism. Military frontiers, however, still demanded constant attention. Augustus strengthened Rome's borders along the Rhine and Danube, ensuring that barbarian incursions could be checked. He preferred secure frontiers over reckless expansion, choosing consolidation instead of endless conquest. But when expansion seemed necessary, he moved decisively. His campaigns in Spain, the Alps, and parts of the East extended Rome's influence, but always with calculation. Augustus's goal wasn't glory in battle, it was an empire that would last beyond him. He built defenses not only of stone but of loyalty, ensuring border provinces saw Rome as protector rather than predator. Still, even Augustus had his failures. The disaster in the Teutoburg forest, where 3 Roman legions were annihilated, shook his empire to the core. News of the massacre left Augustus pacing his palace in despair. crying out for his lost soldiers by name. It was a rare glimpse of vulnerability in a man often painted as invincible. Yet even in loss, Augustus adapted. He didn't chase revenge blindly into German forests. Instead, he reinforced defenses and recalibrated Rome's ambitions. The lesson was harsh but clear. Rome's eternity depended on wisdom, not reckless expansion. Sometimes survival meant knowing when to stop. Despite setbacks, Augustus's image remained untouchable. His careful blending of humility and divinity made him almost mythic in the eyes of Romans. Statues showed him forever young. Propaganda painted him as chosen by the gods, and rituals tied his name to the eternal destiny of Rome. He became less a man and more a symbol, embodying Rome itself. People who never met him spoke of him with reverence, as though he were both father and protector. The Republic had crumbled, but in Augustus, Rome believed it had found a savior. That belief was perhaps his most enduring weapon. The Senate, though reduced in power, played along with his narrative. Many senators despised losing real influence, but they enjoyed the stability Augustus provided. In exchange for bowing to his authority, they kept their wealth, their status, and their lives. Augustus was careful not to humiliate them openly. Instead, he gave them titles and ceremonies, allowing them to feel important while holding no real power. This illusion of dignity smoothed over resentment by letting them play the game of politics without real stakes. Augustus ensured peace in the Senate. The appearance of tradition masked the reality of monarchy. Common Romans, meanwhile, adored him for practical reasons. Grain flowed steadily into the city. Jobs were created through endless building projects, and public games gave them pride. For people who had lived through decades of chaos, Augustus represented relief. He wasn't worshipped just for divine titles or marble temples. He was loved for stability. His reign gave them predictability, and in a world that had known nothing but upheaval, predictability was priceless. He didn't need to call himself king. He had become the rhythm of Roman life itself. In the end, Augustus had crafted something extraordinary. An empire where control didn't feel like oppression, and authority didn't feel like slavery. He disguised absolute power in the robes of tradition, hidden monarchy in the cloak of the Republic, and transformed survival into eternity. This was his greatest genius, not his battles, not his reforms, but his ability to convince an entire civilization that his rule was their freedom. The rise of Augustus was not the rise of a tyrant, but of an illusion so powerful it became reality. Augustus's power was not just political or military, it was personal. He knew appearances could command loyalty as much as legions, so he mastered the art of image. Sculptors crafted him forever, youthful, strong, and serene, no matter his real age. Coins spread that same image across the empire, turning his face into a brand that reached peasants and merchants alike. He became a figure not bound by flesh, but by myth. When Romans saw Augustus, they didn't just see a man. They saw Rome itself embodied. The genius of this branding was subtle but unstoppable. To oppose Augustus felt like opposing Rome's destiny. Yet behind this perfected image was a man who carried scars of suspicion. He never forgot the chaos that had consumed the Republic, and he ruled with a quiet paranoia that kept him cautious. Plots were crushed early, dissent muted before it could gain traction. Augustus didn't unleash terror like later emperors, but he kept careful watch. Secret networks of informants reported whispers from every corner of the city. He rarely struck openly. He preferred subtle silencing, making enemies vanish without spectacle. Rome's peace, it turned out, was as much about invisible chains as it was about marble monuments. Family became both his strength and his greatest vulnerability. Augustus, desperate to secure his line, orchestrated marriages, reshuffled heirs, and tried to engineer a dynasty worthy of eternity. But fate mocked his efforts. Promising heirs died young, others proved unworthy, and scandal gnawed at his household. His beloved daughter Julia became notorious for her affairs, undermining the moral reforms he championed. The personal and political collided brutally, reminding Augustus that even emperors couldn't control family. For all his power, he remained a father haunted by betrayal and disappointment. Still, Augustus turned even family chaos into propaganda. Publicly, he punished Julia's scandals, exiling her as proof of his devotion to moral law. Privately, It must have torn him apart. But he'd never let Rome see weakness. By sacrificing his own daughter to principle, he reinforced his image as impartial guardian of Rome's values. It was harsh, cold, but effective. Romans respected that even Augustus's blood was not above the law. In reality, this was less about morality and more about survival. He could not afford whispers that he was soft on corruption not, after promising to rebuild Rome's virtue. As Augustus aged, the question of succession grew heavier. Who would inherit the empire he had built? He groomed several potential heirs, from Agrippa to his grandsons, but fate struck cruelly. Death thinned his options until only Tiberius, a capable but gloomy general, remained. Augustus accepted this reluctantly, knowing Rome's eternity required continuity above personal preference. By the time he formally adopted Tiberius, he had crafted a system strong enough to endure even uninspiring rulers. Augustus's real legacy wasn't a chosen heir. It was the machinery of empire itself. The provinces continued to benefit from his vision. Augustus didn't treat them as mere conquests, but as parts of a greater whole. Local elites were drawn into Roman administration. Provincial cities flourished under Roman infrastructure, and cultures blended in a new Roman identity. The Mediterranean became a shared world where roads, trade, and law connected distant peoples. This inclusiveness made rebellion less appealing. Why fight Rome when being Rome meant prosperity? Augustus turned conquest into assimilation, and assimilation into loyalty. The empire was not just ruling, it was absorbing. Even in foreign policy, Augustus showed restraint. Unlike generals hungry for endless campaigns, he focused on sustainable boundaries. He strengthened the empire's frontiers, investing in forts and roads rather than reckless invasions. The Teutoburg disaster had taught him that Rome's limits had to be respected. Instead of chasing impossible horizons, he fortified what Rome already held. This shift from expansion to consolidation was revolutionary. Rome didn't need to conquer the world to feel eternal. It only needed to secure its heart and protect its borders. Augustus was no gambler. He was a builder of time. His reforms reached even into the calendar. The Julian calendar, refined under his rule, synchronized Roman life with greater efficiency, making time itself a tool of empire. Festivals were tied to his victories. Months carried imperial significance, and the rhythm of daily life subtly bent around his narrative. Augustus didn't just control land or law, he controlled how Romans experienced the passing of days. Eternity wasn't abstract. It was built into the very way people counted their time. By shaping calendars, Augustus shaped memory. But Augustus's most enduring creation was the myth of Pista, Pax Romana. This peace was not the absence of violence, but the presence of order. Wars still flared on the frontiers. Rebellions flickered in provinces. Yet Romans felt stability. Compared to the blood-drenched chaos of the late Republic, Augustus's reign was paradise. He didn't deliver perfection, he delivered predictability, and that was enough to convince millions that his empire was eternal. The Pax Romana became in lesser policy and more a promise. Rome under Augustus would never again collapse into chaos. When Augustus finally neared the end of his life, Rome looked back on decades of transformation. The boy once dismissed as fragile had become the most powerful man in the world. He'd survived assassins, rivals, betrayals, and disasters. He'd left behind an empire that felt indestructible. His greatest genius was not in his battles, but in his patience, his vision, and his ability to turn illusion into permanence. Augustus was more than a ruler, he was Rome itself, reborn. And in that rebirth, he had crafted the foundation for an empire that would outlast gods, kings, and centuries. Augustus's reign was not just about building marble monuments. It was about carving himself into history as the man chosen by fate. From the very beginning, he understood that legacy mattered as much as power. That's why he spent years reshaping his image from Octavian, the fragile youth, into Augustus, the eternal leader. The Senate's decision to grant him the name Augustus wasn't just ceremony, it was a rebirth. The name carried divine weight, suggesting sanctity and destiny. Every inscription, every coin, every statue repeated this identity until it became unshakable truths. Augustus was not simply a politician. He was the embodiment of Rome's survival. The man who had pulled the Republic from fire and forged it into something stronger. But Augustus didn't stop at symbolism. embedded himself into Rome as its very fabric. His building projects were massive, not only in size, but in meaning. He boasted, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." And while that line might have been self-promotional, it was also true. Temples gleamed under the Italian sun. Aqueducts carried life into distant neighborhoods, and new forums gave Rome grandeur worthy of its empire. Citizens walking through the capital didn't just see stone, they saw Augustus's hand everywhere. By transforming the skyline, he transformed how people imagined their empire. He wasn't just emperor, he was architect of eternity. Religion remained a cornerstone of Augustus's power. He revived ancient rituals, restored neglected temples, and proclaimed himself restorer of Roman tradition. In doing so, he tied his name to the gods themselves. As Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome, Augustus blurred the line between politics and divinity. His leadership wasn't just endorsed by the Senate, it was sanctified by Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. This religious authority reinforced his moral reforms, making obedience to Augustus feel like obedience to the divine order. In a world where religion shaped daily life, Augustus became the mediator between heaven and Rome, his authority reaching beyond law into the sacred. The poets of his age became his heralds. Virgil's Aeneid wasn't just literature, it was a myth-making tunnel, casting Augustus as the heir to Aeneas, destined to found a new golden age. Horace celebrated him as the bringer of stability, the man who had ended decades of chaos. Even Ovid, though later exiled, contributed to a cultural climate where Augustus was more than mortal. Words became weapons, songs became scripture, and Augustus's story was written in verses that would echo for centuries. Through poetry, he stepped beyond time. Generations would read these lines and see Augustus not as a ruler of flesh, but as a figure of destiny. But propaganda alone couldn't hold an empire. Augustus was a master at balancing the expectations of Rome's people. He never called himself king, knowing Romans despised monarchy, but he also never relinquished authority. Instead, he wore republican traditions like a costume. He spoke of restoring the republic, even as he gutted its core. Magistrates still held elections. Senators still debated, but Augustus made sure the outcomes always bent his way. It was an illusion of choice, a stage play of freedom where the script was already written. By disguising monarchy under republican robes, Augustus ensured obedience without rebellion. People accepted his rule because they believed they had chosen it. The Pax Romana that peace Augustus promised became the most persuasive proof of his genius. For decades, Romans had endured civil war, betrayal, and fear. Now, under Augustus, they tasted stability. Families grew without fearing soldiers at the door. Merchants thrived without worrying about raiders, and provinces prospered under predictable rule. Peace wasn't perfect. Rebellions still flared at the edges of Emperor Boo. Compared to what Rome had endured, it felt miraculous. Augustus branded this era as his gift, making it impossible to separate Rome's prosperity from his leadership. As long as bread filled tables and roads remained safe, Augustus was untouchable. Yet, Augustus was never naive. He knew peace depended on power. His army reforms had chained soldier loyalty directly to him, but he also ensured Rome's legions never forgot their strength. Veterans received land and pensions, creating generations bound to Augustus's generosity. Legions stationed on frontiers became both shields and symbols, reminding enemies that Rome's reach was vast, unlike reckless conquerors before him. Augustus didn't gamble on glory. He played the long game, securing borders and strengthening defenses, where others sought fame and expansion. Augustus sought permanence and consolidation. His empire wasn't about stretching endlessly, it was about lasting forever. Augustus's governance of the provinces revealed his strategic brilliance. Instead of ruling through oppression, he built partnerships. Local elites were elevated into Roman society, given privileges that tied their fortunes to Rome's. Infrastructure projects like roads and aqueducts made provincial cities feel like extensions of the capital. Taxes became structured, not arbitrary, reducing resentment. The result was loyalty born not out of fear, but out of shared prosperity. Augustus didn't just conquer territories, he Romanized them, weaving diverse cultures into a single fabric. His genius lay in turning subjects into citizens, creating an empire people wanted to belong to. Behind the grandeur lay personal struggles. Augustus's desperate search for heirs revealed the limits of even his control. He married his daughter Julia to Agrippa, then to Tiberius, reshuffling alliances in hopes of securing the dynasty. Yet heirs died young, scandals erupted, and his household became a battlefield of intrigue. Julia's notorious affairs scandalized Rome, threatening the moral image Augustus had carefully cultivated. Exiling his daughter was a public act of sacrifice, proof that even his own family bowed to his laws. Privately, it was heartbreak. Augustus had conquered armies, rebuilt empires, and bent history, but even he couldn't master fate inside his own bloodline. As Augustus aged, Rome itself became his monument. Citizens who once remembered the Republic now only knew life under his rule. The children of war grew into adults of peace, their identity shaped entirely by Augustus's vision. He had turned decades of chaos into decades of order, ensuring that when he died, Rome would not collapse, but endure. His true gift wasn't victory in battle or marble temples. It was stability woven so deeply that even death couldn't unravel it. Augustus had not just ruled Rome, he had transformed it into an idea larger than himself. And in that idea, he became eternal. The twilight of Augustus's life was painted with both triumph and tension. He had built an empire that stretched across continents, yet the question of succession gnawed at him. Every leader knew that power was fragile the moment it passed to another hand. Augustus worked tirelessly to craft not just his own image, but a dynasty that would last. He elevated Tiberius, his reluctant stepson, grooming him for rule. Even as doubts lingered, Rome watched closely, wondering if the stability Augustus had gifted would endure or shatter once he was gone. In his final years, he carried both pride and burden, even as his health declined. Augustus never abandoned performance. He staged his appearances carefully, ensuring citizens always saw him as steady and strong. In a society built on spectacle, weakness, it was dangerous. Yet behind palace walls, he battled illness. Reflecting on the decades he had ruled, his reign had begun in chaos. A fragile youth holding Rome's future. Now he was an old man, draped in titles, statues, and honors. But mortality weighed heavily. For all his power, he remained human. That awareness gave his final speeches a softer, almost vulnerable tone, an emperor reflecting on his humanity. His last journey to Capri and Naples became almost mythic in memory. Surrounded by family and advisors, Augustus's presence was still magnetic, even frail. Stories say that as he neared death, he asked for a mirror, arranging his hair and asking friends if he had played his part well. "Applaud, for the comedy is finished," he reportedly said. In those words, Augustus revealed how he saw Palais Theater, performance, a stage where emperors were actors. He left life with a curtain call, transforming death itself into part of his legend. Rome grieved not just the loss of a ruler, but the end of an era. Citizens remembered the years before Augustus' civil wars, assassinations, chaos. Compared to that, his reign was golden. Funerals in Rome were grand, but Augustus's was monumental. His body was carried with pomp, his memory sanctified, his name secured among the gods. The Senate declared him Divus Augustus, the divine Augustus, elevating him from man to deity. In death, he achieved what he had crafted in life: immortality. His story was no longer just history, it was mythology. Augustus's mausoleum, rising on the Campus Martis, became a physical reminder of his ambition. Vast, circular, monumental. It held not just his remains but his vision of eternity. Citizens walking past it couldn't forget who had reshaped their world. The structure whispered permanence. A stone guaranteed that Augustus would never vanish from memory. Even centuries later, ruins of the mausoleum echoed his name. He had engineered his afterlife in marble, ensuring his shadow lingered long after the man was gone. For Augustus, memory was victory, and he had won. But the question lingered. Did Augustus truly save Rome, or did he bury the Republic forever? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some see him as a savior, a leader who ended civil war and brought peace. Others argue he was the gravedigger of freedom, replacing republic with empire under disguise. Perhaps both are true. Augustus's genius was that he made Romans believe they still had a republic, even as he ruled as monarch. That paradox was his brilliance and his legacy. He created stability, but it came at the cost of liberty. The empire Augustus built proved resilient, surviving for centuries. Roads stretched across continents. Aqueducts carried water to distant cities, and Roman law became the backbone of civilization. These were not accidents, but the results of Augustus's reforms. His obsession with order and permanence shaped the empire's DNA. Even emperors who failed spectacularly later, Caligula, Nero, benefited from the systems Augustus had laid down. His empire wasn't perfect, but it was durable. In this durability, Augustus lived on, his vision embedded in stone, law, and memory. Art and culture under Augustus blossomed in ways that outlasted his politics. The Aeneid continued to be read as Rome as a sacred epic, inspiring generations. Temples and forums bore his name. Inscriptions glorified his deeds, and coins carried his face. These artifacts weren't just propaganda, they were vessels of memory. When later civilizations uncovered them, Augustus's image returned to life. He had turned culture into immortality, ensuring that even if Rome itself fell, his name would not. He was not only emperor of Rome, but emperor of history. The contradictions of Augustus's reign give it depth. He was both ruthless and merciful, manipulative and visionary, human and divine. He exiled his own daughter to preserve moral authority, yet relied on calculated propaganda to maintain power. He promised to restore the republic, but entrenched monarchy. His rule reveals the tension of leadership, the compromises, the illusions, the sacrifices. It was this complexity that made him endure as a figure of fascination. Augustus was simple, and neither was Rome. Together, they created a story that continues to echo. In the end, Augustus didn't just shape Rome, he shaped how we think about leadership itself. His blend of symbolism, strategy, and spectacle remains a blueprint for power. Modern leaders still borrow from his playbook. Control the narrative, project stability, promise peace, while consolidating authority. The fact that his name endures after 2,000 years proves his success. Augustus was more than a man. He was an architect of eternity, and like the marble he left behind, his story refuses to crumble. The image of Augustus was never just about one man. It became a brand, stamped across the empire. Coins carried his profile, showing his youth and strength even as he aged. Statues depicted him as both a general and a god, a father of Rome and a ruler above mortals. Everywhere citizens turned, they saw Augustus, not in person but in symbols. He had mastered the art of being both present and untouchable, visible everywhere yet distant. In shaping his image, Augustus built one of the earliest examples of political branding. Propaganda under Augustus was more than surface-level decoration. It was narrative control. The poet Virgil, with his epic Aeneid, wove a myth that Augustus's rise was destined by the gods. Horace and Ovid sang of Rome's golden age under his rule. Every play, poem, and inscription seemed to point to the same truths. Augustus wasn't just a ruler. He was the chosen one. By embedding his story in art and literature, he gave Romans something to believe in. Rulers before him had armies. Augustus had armies and stories, and that made him unshakable. His use of religion as political glue was no less brilliant. By restoring old temples and reviving rituals, he cast himself as Rome's protector of tradition. Yet these acts weren't only pious gestures, they were calculated moves to connect his regime with the divine. Festivals celebrated both the gods and Augustus, blending the sacred with the political. People came to see him not as a usurper of the old republic, but as its guardian. Chosen Butha, this seamless merging of state and faith, made resistance almost unthinkable. The reforms Augustus implemented reached deep into Roman life. He passed laws to strengthen family structures, promoting marriage and discouraging adultery. He encouraged moral discipline, tying private behavior to the stability of the empire. Not all citizens loved these restrictions. Some saw them as invasive, but they revealed Augustus's vision. A Rome disciplined in both public and private life. For him, Moral order was as crucial as military order. By shaping homes, he shaped the empire's future. This blending of politics with private morality gave his reign unusual depth. Even the city itself became his canvas. Augustus once claimed, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." That boast captured his transformation of Rome's skyline. Forums, temples, and theaters rose, all echoing his presence. These weren't vanity projects alone. They provided jobs, beautified the capital, and symbolized stability. Citizens walking through Rome could physically feel the empire's grandeur. Each building whispered, "Augustus rules. Augustus provides. Augustus endures." His architecture wasn't just stone, it was ideology carved into the heart of Rome. Augustus's control extended into the military. He reduced the chaos of legions loyal to individual generals, made them loyal to the staten. By extension, to him. Veterans were settled in colonies, their loyalty secured through land and pensions. The Praetorian Guard, his personal elite force, ensured his safety in Rome. This shift in military power was subtle but revolutionary. Soldiers no longer saw themselves as tools of ambitious generals, but as defenders of the empire. By professionalizing the military, Augustus prevented the kind of civil wars that had nearly destroyed Rome. Economically, his policies brought stability as well. He reformed taxation, cutting out corruption by using direct collection instead of relying on greedy middlemen. Trade routes flourished across the Mediterranean, with grain from Egypt feeding Rome's massive. These Pax Romana allowed markets to grow, artisans to thrive, and wealth to circulate. The empire became not just a military machine, but an economic powerhouse. Augustus understood that prosperity was as vital as legions. Hungry citizens rebel, fed citizens cheer. His careful balance of economics and politics kept Rome steady. The concept of time itself was reshaped under Augustus. By reforming the calendar, he gave Romans consistency and predictability. Festivals aligned, harvests tracked, and time felt orderly. This wasn't just convenience, it was psychological power. An emperor who could control time itself seemed larger than life. Combined with his reforms, his projects, and his propaganda, Augustus created a Rome where every detail from the calendar to the cityscape reminded citizens of his presence. He had woven himself into the daily rhythm of life. Yet beneath this success lay tension. Some aristocrats resented his control, whispering that Rome had traded freedom for comfort. They saw the Senate reduced to a shadow of its former self, their voices drowned by Augustus's dominance. But for the ordinary citizen, freedom was less valuable than food, security, and peace. To them, Augustus was no tyrant. He was a savior. The divide between elite resentment and public adoration reveals the genius of his system. Augustus ruled by winning the hearts of the masses, while sidelining rivals. His ability to adapt kept him ahead of threats. Whenever opposition arose, he neutralized it not always with violence, but with patience, propaganda, or negotiation. He didn't need to crush every enemy because he could outmaneuver them. This subtlety distinguished him from the brutal dictators of the past. Augustus's reign was proof that power didn't always require terror. Sometimes, the sharpest weapon was patience, the strongest wall was image, and the greatest empire was built on trust, carefully engineered. Augustus understood the power of patience. Instead of ruling like a tyrant, he preferred to wait, to outlast his enemies. Many who opposed him early on eventually faded into irrelevance, their voices drowned by the empire's new rhythm. His control was not always visible, but it was everywhere like air, unseen but inescapable. This invisible authority made Augustus not just powerful, but untouchable. Rome had never seen such subtle mastery. His leadership style blended firmness with diplomacy. He rewarded loyalty generously, granting wealth or positions to those who served faithfully. At the same time, betrayal carried quiet consequences. Unlike earlier leaders who flaunted executions, Augustus often chose exile or erasure. This softer hand created the image of a merciful ruler. Even when his decisions were calculated, it was governance by illusion. Harsh when needed, gentle when convenient. Augustus also excelled at playing different roles. Two soldiers. He was the supreme general. 2 senators. He was a respectful partner. 2 ordinary Romans. He was the provider. By shifting masks, depending on the audience, he became all things to all people. This flexibility ensured that no single group saw him as a threat. Instead, they saw him as indispensable. He became the glue binding Rome's many worlds together. His reforms reached far beyond politics. Augustus invested in aqueducts, roads, and harbors, knitting the empire together with infrastructure. Travel became easier, trade became faster, and cities flourished. The more connected Rome became, the stronger Augustus's image grew. He was not just a man sitting in the capital. He was present in every road, every aqueduct, every port. His influence stretched across stone and steel, embedding him in daily life. The Roman postal system was another of his innovations. By creating a network for communication across vast distances, Augustus ensured information flowed quickly and securely. This gave him eyes and ears across the empire, preventing revolts before they could grow. Citizens benefited too, seeing the empire as more efficient and united. By mastering communication, Augustus shortened the empire, making faraway provinces feel closer. He was shrinking geography itself. His foreign policy was as strategic as his domestic reforms. Rather than endless expansion, Augustus preferred stability. He drew clear borders, built defenses, and secured treaties. Rome did not stop conquering, but it conquered wisely, not recklessly. He understood that an empire stretched too thin would collapse under its own weight. His balance of ambition and restraint allowed Rome to enjoy peace without losing its edge. Augustus also had a gift for symbolism. Victories were celebrated not just with parades, but with monuments, coins, and rituals. Every triumph became part of Rome's collective memory. Even defeats were reframed as stepping stones toward greater victories. He turned history itself into propaganda, ensuring that no matter what happened, the narrative always favored him. In shaping the past, Augustus secured the future. The family Augustus built was part of his political machine. Through marriages, adoptions, and alliances, he wove a dynasty while pretending Rome was still a republic. Each connection strengthened his network, ensuring his influence would outlive him. Though not all family members lived up to his expectations, the image of a ruling household became part of Rome's DNA. Emperors would rise and fall, but the idea of dynastic succession began with Augustus. His personal life, though carefully managed, still revealed his humanity. He could be cautious, even anxious. Worried about plots against him, he valued loyalty, but distrusted ambition. Friends who rose to high risks becoming enemies. His paranoia, subtle but real, reminded Rome that even Augustus was not invincible. Yet instead of weakening him, it made him sharper, always one step ahead of danger. Ultimately, Augustus turned survival into strategy. Every civil war survivor before him had eventually fallen, undone by arrogance or violence. But Augustus broke the cycle. He built an empire not just on victories, but on vision, patience, and control. He proved that Rome's future could be secured not by the sword alone, but by the mind. That was his true genius, the ability to outthink history itself. The image of Augustus, as a godlike figure, was not built overnight. He carefully crafted it through temples, festivals, and subtle language that elevated him above mortals, without openly declaring himself divine. By the time Romans worshipped his spirit after death, it felt natural, almost inevitable. He had rewritten the role of leadership into something eternal. Where a ruler was more than a man, he was destiny itself. Religion became one of his most powerful tools. By restoring old traditions while introducing new rituals, Augustus tied Rome's identity to his presence. Every sacrifice, every procession, seemed to honor not just the gods but Augustus himself. This blending of divine and political authority blurred the lines until questioning him felt like questioning the gods. It was faith turned into loyalty, and loyalty turned into power. The arts also flourished under his rule. Poets like Virgil and Horace wrote works that celebrated Rome's greatness and Augustus's role in it. These weren't just stories, they were cultural weapons, embedding the idea that Rome's destiny was tied to its emperor. Through verse and myth, Augustus became immortalized long before his death. Art and propaganda merged, leaving Rome enchanted and upbeat. Architecture played its part as well. Augustus famously declared he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Walking through grand forums and shining temples, citizens felt pride and awe. The city itself whispered Augustus's greatness. With every column and every arch, he didn't just rule people, he ruled their imaginations. Public games and spectacles added another layer of control. Gladiatorial contests, naval battles, and theatrical performances. Refunded by Augustus, making him the ultimate benefactor. Romans enjoyed entertainment while being subtly reminded of who provided it. Bread and circuses kept the masses happy, but they also tied joy and survival to Augustus's generosity. It was emotional politics at its finest. His handling of the Senate remained a masterclass in manipulation. Though he held ultimate power, he allowed senators to believe they still mattered. Titles, honors, ceremonial gestures gave them dignity, while Augustus retained the substance of authority. By stroking their pride while limiting their influence, he avoided rebellion and ensured cooperation. It was a silent domination wrapped in respect. The military, though loyal to him, was never left unchecked. Augustus reduced the number of legions, created permanent bases, and established pensions for veterans. This ensured soldiers fought for Rome, not individual generals. The Praetorian Guard, his personal security force, kept him safe while projecting authority. Augustus understood that armies could make or break rulers, so he made them his foundation. Even taxation was reformed under his watch. Augustus introduced ferry systems, reducing corruption and stabilizing revenue. Citizens noticed the difference: less exploitation, more order. The empire's wealth grew steadily, allowing for projects that benefited everyone. By turning taxes into visible improvements, Augustus made citizens less resentful of paying. His economic foresight helped secure Rome's prosperity long after his reign. Provincial governance also improved. Augustus appointed governors carefully, demanding accountability and loyalty. Revolts diminished. As provinces felt more integrated into the empire, roads and trade bound them closer to Rome, creating a sense of shared destiny. The empire wasn't just a conqueror, it became a system that people could live within, try by wheaten, and eventually even identify with. At the heart of it all was Augustus himself. Calm, deliberate, and enduring. Unlike rulers who burned bright and fell fast, he built slowly, carefully, ensuring every stone of his empire rested on solid ground. His genius lay not just in ruling, but in preparing Rome for a future beyond his lifetime. He wasn't merely a man of the moment, he was the architect of eternity. Augustus spent his final years not only ruling but contemplating the nature of power itself. He had lived through chaos, turned a fragile republic into a functioning empire, and carved out decades of stability. Yet beneath the triumph, he knew his position was precarious. Power could be inherited, stolen, or destroyed by ambition. He understood that Rome's strength depended not on battles won but on systems built, and he had worked tirelessly to create one that would outlast him. Every reform, every law, and every symbolic gesture was part of this larger puzzle. But as his help declined, the looming question kept circling back. Who would take his place? His reign had been one long gamble against disorder, and he feared one wrong choice could unravel everything. Succession was never a simple matter. Bloodlines did not guarantee loyalty or competence, and Augustus had seen too many noble families embroiled with rivalries. That is why he approached the question, not as a father, but as a strategist. He understood that an heir must command respect, manage the army, and hold the Senate in cautious balance. Natural children were not enough. Adoption became his weapon of choice. Through this clever maneuver, he redefined family ties into political tools, ensuring that Rome's stability came before blood. By elevating heirs through adoption, Augustus created continuity without being trapped by weak descendants. It was a radical solution, but it reflected his belief that Rome's survival was more important than any personal dynasty. Among those heirs, Tiberius emerged as the most viable, though hardly the most beloved. Augustus had long tested him with commands and responsibilities, shaping him into someone who could bear the immense burden of empire. Tiberius was often seen as sullen, distant, and unpopular with both citizens and senators. Yet Augustus recognized that beneath this cold surface lay a resilience Rome would one day require. Where others saw aloofness, Augustus saw steadiness, where critics complained of his moodiness. Augustus saw a cautious mind, unwilling to rush into decisions without calculation. Choosing Tiberius was not about charm or popularity. It was about strength, in a time when only strength could preserve the fragile balance Augustus had built. The Roman people had, over the decades, grown accustomed to his disguised monarchy. Though Augustus always maintained the facade of republican traditions, by the end of his reign, no one doubted who truly held power. The Senate played along, grateful for stability after generations of turmoil. Magistrates wore their robes and performed ceremonies, but the decisions that mattered flowed from Augustus. By the time he prepared his heir, the Roman people had already been conditioned to accept one-man rule as normal. Resistance had faded not through force, but through habit, and this subtle acceptance was perhaps Augustus' greatest political victory. The people no longer asked if one man should rule, they simply expected that someone would. His monuments reinforced this new reality. Every temple, every arch, every public space carried his mark. The calendar bore his name. Coins carried his image. Even time itself had been reshaped to orbit around Augustus. By branding Rome with himself, he ensured that his presence lingered beyond his lifetime. Citizens could not walk through the forum, march down a road, or celebrate a festival without encountering his influence. He had turned the city into a living memory of his reign. Rome was Augustus, and Augustus was Rome. This was more than Venetiate, was strategy, embedding his legacy so deeply into Roman life that it would feel impossible to imagine the state without him. The Pax Romana stood as his greatest proof. Generations who had once grown up in fear of war, famine, and political purges now lived in peace and prosperity. Commerce flourished, roads expanded, and Rome became the center of a world stitched together by law and order. The peace felt so natural that people began to believe Rome had always been destined for stability. Yet this illusion was Augustus' most delicate construction. Behind the calm facade, it was still his discipline, his reforms, and his control that kept the machine running. The Pax Romana was not destiny. It was design, and only by carefully choosing his successor could that design continue. When Augustus finally died, Rome did not collapse into chaos as so many empires before had done. The system he built functioned smoothly, almost like a machine that no longer needed its creator. The Senate, the army, and the people moved seamlessly into the next chapter. Guided by the structures Augustus had left behind, to many, it seemed as though he was still present, directing events from beyond the grave. His vision of permanence had worked, at least for the moment. Rome continued without pause, a testament to the durability of his blueprint. The Senate declared him divine, lifting him beyond mortality. Augustus was now not just a ruler of men, but a god in Roman story. Temples were erected in his honor, and prayers were offered in his name. To worship Augustus was to worship Rome itself, and his divinity blurred the line between religion and politics. This was the final transformation. The man who once presented himself as a humble servant of the Republic had become a god whose legacy fused with eternity. In this way, he transcended the fragile limits of human life, became part of the myth that sustained the empire. Yet divinity was not his only legacy. More than temples or titles, Augustus left behind a system that could endure. He had learned from the mistakes of Julius Caesar, who reached for power too directly and paid the ultimate price. Augustus instead cloaked authority with subtlety, balancing appearances with reality until resistance faded. His genius lay not in brute force, but in patience, in the slow reshaping of political culture until empire felt natural. By the time his reign ended, the Republic was not destroyed, but transformed beyond recognition. It still existed in name, but its spirit belonged entirely to Augustus' creation. His story ends not with death, but with permanence. Augustus did not simply rule for a lifetime. He built eternity. Every reform, every choice, and every monument was a brick in the foundation of an empire that would outlive him by centuries. Though emperors after him would rise and fall, Rome itself carried his stamp. His reign was not about conquering lands alone, but about conquering time, ensuring that his vision of order and stability would endure long after his body was gone. In this sense, Augustus was more than a man. He was the architect of eternity. After Augustus' death, the transition to Tiberius wasn't as smooth emotionally as it was politically. The people respected Augustus so much that anyone stepping into his shoes seemed destined to look smaller. Tiberius, with his stoic demeanor and lack of warmth, struggled to inspire the same affection. Crowds who once cheered Augustus now watched in uneasy silence, uncertain if Tiberius could carry the weight of empire. This wasn't rebellion, it was grief mixed with doubt. The Roman world had lost a father figure, and the son who followed seemed like a stranger in comparison. Tiberius himself was not eager for power. He had lived much of his life in reluctant service, often preferring isolation over public life. But Augustus' careful grooming and insistence placed him at the empire's helm. His reign began cautiously, as though he feared one misstep would shatter the delicate balance his adoptive father had built. Every decision he made carried the shadow of Augustus. Every policy compared to the golden standard of his predecessor. In some ways, Tiberius ruled less as his own man and more as a caretaker of Augustus' system. Despite the unease, Augustus' blueprint held firm. The Senate functioned, the legions remained loyal, and the people continued their daily lives without disruption. This was proof of Augustus' genius. He had crafted an empire that could survive its founder. Tiberius didn't need to reinvent governance. He simply needed to maintain it. Even if he lacked charisma, the machinery of Rome was already set in motion. Powered by the reforms Augustus had left behind, the empire's momentum carried it forward, easing the burden of transition. The Roman elite, however, whispered doubts in private. Senators who once bowed to Augustus out of reverence now treated Tiberius with measured suspicion. They tested his patience, pushed the boundaries of their privileges, and waited to see if he would flinch. But Tiberius, though awkward in public, was no fool. He knew the Senate could be both a tool and a trap. He wielded restraint, letting them speak, but never forgetting that Augustus had shown how appearances could hide absolute control. Tiberius may not have been loved, but he commanded respect in silence. Meanwhile, the Roman legions remained the backbone of imperial stability. Augustus had tied their loyalty not just to commanders but to the empire itself, ensuring that they saw their fortunes linked to Rome's survival. Tiberius inherited this loyalty, though he always kept a watchful eye on potential rivals. The army's discipline was a direct reflection of Augustus' reforms: fixed salaries, land grants, and pensions. These practical measures had turned soldiers from restless adventurers into invested stakeholders in the empire's future. It was one of the reasons Rome didn't fracture after Augustus' passing. The ordinary citizens of Rome felt the continuity most in their everyday lives. Grain shipments still arrived, games were still held, taxes remained stable. To them, the death of Augustus was an emotional blow, but life went on smoothly. This was no accident. Augustus had worked tirelessly to institutionalize peace, making the system more important than the individual. In doing so, he made himself immortal in practice, because his vision continued to shape daily life long after he was gone. Augustus' deification added another layer to his legacy. By declaring him a god, Rome gave citizens a way to continue worshiping stability itself. Shrines and temples to Augustus were not just acts of reverence. They were reminders of the peace he delivered. For Tiberius, this was both a blessing and a curse. He ruled in the shadow of a god, judged against an impossible standard, yet benefiting from the aura of divinity that legitimized his reign. Augustus had become both a protector and a haunting presence. The empire expanded cautiously under Tiberius, but the true story lay not in new conquests, but in the maintenance of order. Augustus had taught Rome that glory was not only won on battlefields, but preserved in institutions. Roads, laws, and provincial governance mattered just as much as victories. Tiberius inherited this lesson, focusing less on flashy campaigns and more on stability. It was not glamorous, but it was effective, and it showed the lasting influence of Augustus' philosophy of rule. For historians, the transition from Augustus to Tiberius marks a critical test of the Augustan system. Would Rome remain stable without the charismatic founder, or collapse as so many empires had after their great leader's death? The answer, at least to the short term, was stability. Augustus' greatest victory wasn't a battle won, but a structure built. His empire survived him, proving that his rule had reshaped Rome's very DNA. The Republic was gone, but the empire lived on stronger than ever. In this way, Augustus achieved what even Julius Caesar could not: permanence. Where Caesar's ambition was cut down by daggers, Augustus subtly forged a system no blade could kill. His genius was not in shocking moments, but in gradual transformation. By the time Rome realized what it had become, the Republic was long buried, and the Empire was the new reality. Augustus had written himself into eternity not as a fleeting conqueror, but as the architect of a world that endured. The memory of Augustus lingered in every corner of Rome. Citizens still spoke of his achievements as if he were alive, and poets filled their verses with his name. Temples built in his honor reminded everyone that he had not just ruled, he had reshaped the destiny of the empire. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was a cultural anchor. Romans believed that through Augustus, the gods themselves had smiled upon their city. Even in death, he provided legitimacy to the rulers who followed, his divine aura casting long shadows across the empire. Augustus had mastered the art of appearances. He allowed the Senate to keep its rituals, magistrates to wear their robes, and assemblies to meet. But behind the curtain, the real decisions always lay in his hands. This careful balance between illusion and reality meant that Rome transitioned from republic to empire almost without resistance. By respecting traditions while quietly hollowing them out, Augustus ensured that his power seemed natural. Future emperors inherited this system, and it became the model for how absolute rule could wear the mask of tradition. In the provinces, Augustus' reforms had an even greater impact. Local elites were drawn into Rome's orbit, granted privileges in exchange for loyalty. Roads connected distant towns, tax systems were standardized, and law was applied more uniformly. People who might once have seen Rome as an occupier began to view it as a stabilizing force. The Augustan vision transformed conquered lands into functioning parts of the empire. His genius wasn't only in conquest, but in integration, turning diversity into unity under Rome's banner. Religion, too, became a powerful instrument of his rule. By linking his reign to divine will, Augustus blurred the line between politics and faith. He restored old temples, sponsored priesthoods, and introduced cults that elevated the image of Rome's destiny. His own divinity at death wasn't a surprise, it was the culmination of years of carefully weaving religion into governance. Worshipping Augustus meant worshipping the empire itself, and this created a loyalty deeper than fear or obligation. The Roman economy thrived under the stability Augustus established. With trade routes secure and piracy suppressed, merchants carried goods across the Mediterranean with confidence. Grain from Egypt, silk from the Egypt, and gold from Spain flowed into Roman markets. Prosperity became the empire's strongest advertisement. Citizens linked peace and wealth directly to Augustus' leadership. Even after his death, this connection made future rulers dependent on continuing his policies. To govern Rome meant maintaining the Augustan promise of stability and abundance. Augustus' legacy also reshaped the Roman identity. Before him, Romans defined themselves by the Republic's values, traditions, and political freedoms. After him, they began to define themselves by empire. Rome was no longer a city with a republic. It was the center of a world-spanning order. Augustus had changed how Romans thought about themselves. They were heirs, not of a senate, but of an emperor's vision. That mental shift was perhaps his most lasting reform, for it ensured that empire became the natural state of Rome. His family, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, carried his blood and his adopted heirs, but their legitimacy always circled back to Augustus. Even when later emperors faltered, they invoked his name. Augustus became a yardstick of legitimacy, a standard by which all rulers were measured. The empire's stability, in many ways, depended on the enduring myth of Augustus. As the perfect ruler, his successors could never fully escape his shadow, for his reign had set expectations nearly impossible to match. Culturally, the Augustan age became a golden standard. Writers like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid flourished under his patronage, producing works that celebrated Rome's destiny. These texts not only entertained, but also reinforced Augustus' vision of empire. Through literature, his reign extended into the imagination of generations. He wasn't just a ruler of armies, but a patron of ideas, shaping how Romans understood their history and future. The arts became another weapon in his arsenal, forging loyalty through beauty and narrative. The Roman military, often seen as unstoppable, owed much of its discipline to Augustus' reforms. He professionalized the legions, secured their loyalty through pay and land, and stationed them strategically across the empire. This prevented both rebellion and invasion. Soldiers no longer fought only for plunder, they fought for Rome's stability. Augustus transformed the army from a political threat into the backbone of imperial security. This ensured that when he died, the legions did not splinter, but remained loyal to the system he had created. In the end, Augustus' rise was more than a personal triumph. It was the blueprint for empire. He took a city torn by civil war and remade it into the heart of the known world. His genius lay not in dramatic speeches or reckless ambition, but in careful planning, patience, and relentless vision. Every decision, every reform, every gesture had one goal: to make Rome eternal. That is why he earned the title Architect of Eternity. His reign may have ended, but his influence shaped the empire for centuries. Augustus' power was built on more than swords and laws. It was built on trust. The Roman people trusted that he could keep chaos away, and in return, he gave them stability. This silent contract was the foundation of his empire. For decades, citizens had lived through civil wars and betrayals. With Augustus, they finally felt secure. That sense of safety became addictive, and it kept people loyal even when freedoms were lost. In their minds, peace was worth the price of politics. The imagery Augustus used also told the story. Coins, statues, and monuments weren't just art, they were propaganda. Every symbol reinforced the message that Augustus was both humble and divine, both a servant and a savior. His genius was in making people believe he embodied Rome itself. When citizens saw his face stamped on currency or carved into marble, they weren't just looking at a man, they were looking at the empire. This clever merging of identity and power made him unforgettable. He also understood psychology. Augustus avoided the flamboyance that doomed Julius Caesar. Instead of dazzling with power, he cloaked it in moderation. He called himself Princeps, the first citizen, as though he were no more important than any other Roman. But behind this modest title was an emperor in all but name. By appearing humble, he calmed suspicions, and by appearing ordinary, he normalized extraordinary power. This illusion became one of the strongest tools of his reign. Augustus knew Rome's heartbeat in its traditions. That's why he restored old temples, revived ancient rituals, and emphasized the connection between Rome's destiny and the gods. Even skeptics felt reassured by this return to familiar customs. In reality, he was reinventing religion to serve politics. By presenting himself as chosen by the gods, he turned faith into loyalty. Romans didn't just follow him because of his policies, they followed him because they believed he carried divine approval. The Senate remained a stage for Augustus' performance. He allowed them to debate, propose laws, and carry out ceremonies. But the real script was always his. Senators knew it, yet they played their parts. Some resented it, but most preferred this arrangement to the chaos of civil war. Augustus had given them a choice: symbolic honor or deadly instability. They chose survival. By keeping the Senate intact, he gave his rule the appearance of legality, even as he quietly held all power. Augustus also understood the importance of controlling narratives beyond Rome. In provinces, governors reported stability, prosperity, and loyalty. Roads built during his reign didn't just move goods, they moved ideas. Word of Rome's strength spread across Europe, Africa, and Asia. By standardizing governance and taxation, he gave conquered peoples a reason to cooperate. Resistance grew weaker because life under Rome became more predictable. To many, Augustus wasn't just a conqueror, he was a stabilizer who turned empire into order. The army remained his most loyal pillar. Augustus had reshaped it into a professional force, bound to state rather than individuals. Retirement benefits and land grants tied soldiers' futures to Rome's survival. Generals who once threatened to become rivals were now dependent on Augustus' system. Soldiers admired his discipline, respected his rewards, and feared his authority. By taming the military, he achieved what no Roman before him had done. He made the sword loyal to the state rather than to Augustus. Augustus' personal life was less straightforward. His marriages, adoptions, and family politics often looked like messy dramas, but they were calculated moves. Every relationship was a political tool. By marrying into powerful families and adopting heirs, he built alliances that secured his rule. The public saw these choices as family affairs, but insiders knew they were strategies through familial ties. Augustus made Rome itself his household, weaving personal bonds into political control. The image of Augustus as a moral reformer also shaped his reputation. He introduced laws encouraging marriage, punishing adultery, and promoting family values. Some Romans grumbled, but the laws reinforced the idea that Augustus cared about Rome's moral health as much as its political stability. Even if enforcement was inconsistent, the symbolism mattered. He wasn't just ruling, but he was shaping hearts and minds, positioning himself as the guardian of Roman virtue. In the long view, Augustus was less a destroyer of the Republic than its silent transformer. He didn't burn it down, he hollowed it out and filled it with something new. To the casual eye, the Republic still existed, but in truth, its spirit was gone, replaced by empire. This sleight of hand was his greatest trick. Rome didn't wake up one day and discover it had lost its republic. It simply adjusted, step by step, until it could no longer imagine life without Augustus at the helm. The legacy of Augustus wasn't limited to politics, it shaped culture itself. Roman literature, art, and architecture flourished under his patronage. Virgil wrote the Aeneid not just as a poem, but as a national epic that tied Augustus to Rome's mythical past. Horace celebrated the peace and prosperity of the age in verses that ordinary Romans could recite. Even Ovid, though exiled later, captured the vibrancy of Roman life under Augustus. Through these works, Augustus ensured that his reign lived not only in stone but also in words. Architecture became one of his loudest statements. The Arapaces, or altar of peace, stood as a visual symbol of stability. Public baths, theaters, and forums built during his rule made life more comfortable for citizens. These weren't just luxuries, they were tools of propaganda. Every structure reminded people that Augustus brought prosperity. Walking through Rome became an experience of gratitude, as though the city itself whispered, "This peace exists because of him." Augustus made stone his storyteller. The Augustan family was also a carefully crafted performance. Statues of Livia, his wife, portrayed her as the embodiment of Roman virtue, dignified, loyal, and modest. His heirs were shown as future leaders, ensuring the public saw continuity even when scandals plagued his family. Augustus controlled the narrative. He punished when necessary, forgave when useful, and always framed events to protect Rome's image. By turning family into politics, Augustus blurred the line between private life and public theater. Religion deepened his power further. By becoming Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, Augustus controlled not only politics, but also spirituality. Festivals celebrated his victories, and prayers linked his name with Rome's destiny. To the people, this felt natural. Why? Wouldn't the man who secured peace also secure divine favor? By fusing religion and state, Augustus ensured loyalty came from both fear of the gods and trust in leadership. His divinity after death was the natural conclusion of this system. The provinces benefited most from his reforms. Roads linked villages to trade routes. Aqueducts brought water, and Roman law gave structure. Elites in Spain, gold, when the East discovered that cooperating with Rome meant wealth and influence. Instead of crushing diversity, Augustus absorbed it, allowing local cultures to thrive under Roman order. This integration turned former enemies into partners. By making empire feel inclusive, he ensured longevity far beyond what military conquest alone could achieve. The army, though disciplined, was never neglected. Augustus rotated legions, stationed them strategically, and ensured they had land upon retirement. These policies curbed rebellion while giving soldiers a stake in Rome's survival. He didn't just demand loyalty, he purchased it with security and opportunity. Veterans became farmers, blending into provinces and spreading Roman culture. Augustus transformed the sword into a plow, ensuring that soldiers not only fought for him, but also built the empire's future. Augustus also reshaped time itself. The calendar reform introduced during his reign aligned months with the solar year, making agriculture more reliable. The month of August bore his name, embedding him into the rhythm of everyday life. Even centuries later, his presence lingers every time someone writes a date. This was more than vanity, it was permanence. By stamping his name into time, Augustus ensured he would be remembered as long as Rome itself existed. The Roman economy thrived because of his balance between order and ambition. Taxes were collected efficiently, corruption reduced, and trade encouraged. Egypt's grain fed Rome, while Eastern luxuries and Western resources enriched the city. Augustus understood that prosperity was the strongest shield against dissent. When people's stomachs were full and markets bustled, loyalty followed. His reign proved that empire could survive not only by war but by wealth. Economic stability became his silent weapon. In the outs, Augustus wasn't just a patrony. As a curator, he chose which voices to amplify, favoring works that glorified Rome's destiny. By guiding culture, he made sure the empire's story was always told in flattering tones. Artists gained fame, citizens gained pride, and Augustus gained immortality through creativity. This cultural golden age wasn't accidental, it was engineered. A campaign of persuasion as powerful as any military conquest. Ultimately, Augustus created a system so resilient that it could survive weak rulers, civil strife, and external threats. His genius was not in eliminating danger, but in preparing Rome to withstand it. He gave the empire a spine of institutions, traditions, and narratives strong enough to carry centuries of history. The Republic died quietly, but the empire thrived loudly, built on his vision. That is why Augustus stands not just as a ruler of his time, but as the architect of eternity. Augustus' reign has often been described as a paradox, and it's easy to see why. He dismantled the Republic while claiming to restore it, turned a fragile democracy into a monarchy, cloaked in tradition, and managed to convince an entire empire that he was not a king, but simply the first citizen. This balancing act worked because Augustus understood people's deepest desire was not freedom, but security. Romans had seen enough chaos of war, assassinations, political betrayals to realize liberty without order was worthless. Augustus gave them stability and peace, and in return, they gave him loyalty. His greatest genius wasn't in battles, but in illusions, creating a system where the people surrendered power willingly, because he made them believe it was for their own survival. What set Augustus apart from other rulers of his age was patience. While generals and politicians before him sought quick glory with wars and flashy triumphs, Augustus chose consolidation. He knew expansion without order was a recipe for a collapse. Instead of chasing every battlefield, he built roads, established tax reforms, reorganized the army, and secured provinces. His vision of empire was less about temporary victories and more about endurance. This was not the brilliance of a conqueror, but the foresight of an architect. To him, the true prize was not in banners raised on conquered lands, but in the knowledge that Rome would stand unshaken for generations. His approach shifted history's definition of greatness from the fire of conquest to the slow burn of stability. For the Roman people, the transformation was almost invisible because it was gradual. Under Augustus, the Republic wasn't ripped apart overnight. It quietly withered. Senators still debated, magistrates still wore their robes, and assemblies still gathered. Yet behind these rituals, Augustus made every real decision. Rome was being hollowed out and resealed with something new. Empire. By the time most citizens realized what had happened, they no longer remembered the Republic as a living reality. It was just a story of the past. What Augustus created was not only a political shift, but a psychological one. He taught Romans to see empire as natural, inevitable, even desirable. Once that mental transformation was complete, there was no going back. Leadership itself was redefined by Augustus. Where Julius Caesar had reached for power boldly and paid with his life, Augustus grasped power quietly and held it for decades. His rules showed that authority did not always need to roar, could whisper. He crafted an image of humility, calling himself princeps instead of dictator or king, allowing Romans to feel he was one of them. Yet behind this mask, he controlled armies, provinces, and the treasury. By ruling with restraint in appearance but absolute control in fact, he created a model of leadership that balanced fear with trust. This style proved far more durable than Caesar's flamboyance. Augustus' strength lay not in constant displays of might, but in patient design. Future emperors followed his model, but none could escape his shadow. Even rulers who failed invoked his name to justify their authority. Augustus became the eternal benchmark of legitimacy, the measure of all emperors to come. His system endured because it wasn't tied to charisma alone. Unlike Caesar, who embodied personal magnetism, Augustus left behind institutions, laws, and traditions strong enough to carry on without him. That's why his legacy didn't die with his body. The throne he built wasn't for Augustus Salona, it was for Rome. And Rome, as long as it followed his design, could withstand generations of rulers, both brilliant and disastrous. Ordinary Romans also lived his legacy in tangible ways. They held coins with his image, walked on roads built under his direction, and ate food delivered through trade networks secured by his armies. Augustus wasn't an abstract ruler. He was part of their daily lives. The grain from Egypt that filled their bellies, the games that entertained their evenings, the peace that allowed merchants to travel safely, all of it bore his stamp. By intertwining himself with the rhythms of everyday life, Augustus made loyalty instinctive. People didn't just respect him because of his titles. They respected him because his rule touched every corner of their survival. That everyday presence was more powerful than any speech or law. When Augustus was declared divine after his death, the act sealed his place in memory as more than a man. But in truth, he had already become a living myth during his lifetime. Declaring him a god simply formalized what Romans already believed, that he embodied Rome's destiny. Temples rose in his honor. Prayers were whispered in his name, and his divinity blurred the line between politics and religion. Worshipping Augustus was worshipping stability itself. The man who once positioned himself as humble first citizen had now become the eternal protector of Rome. Future emperors leaned heavily on this precedent, using Augustus' godlike status to bolster their own fragile claims. The empire he left behind was not flawless, but it was remarkably strong. Corruption existed, ambition brewed, and conspiracies whispered in shadows. Yet the system held. Rome faced crises after Augustus, but none of them shattered the foundations he had built. His empire wasn't invincible, but it was resilient, and resilience is often more powerful than perfection. By giving Rome a backbone of institutions and traditions, Augustus ensured the state could bend without breaking. That flexibility allowed Rome to survive centuries of turmoil, invasions, and weaken. It was his foresight that carried the empire, not the charisma of successors. Augustus' brilliance lay in thinking beyond his own lifetime. Many rulers plan for victories they can see. Augustus planned for a world he would never live in. He wasn't content to govern Rome, he wanted to shape its eternity. His reforms were designed with longevity in mind. Whether in the army, the economy, or the province, he created a machine that could run without him. A structure that ensured Rome would thrive long after his death. That vision set him apart from every other leader of his time. He wasn't just a ruler, he was a builder of futures, crafting Rome into something bigger than himself. And so, the story of Augustus doesn't end with his death, but with his permanence. Rome carried his imprint for centuries, and even today, his influence echoes in discussions of power, governance, and leadership. He turned chaos into stability, weakness into resilience, and ambition into eternity. Augustus rose from the ashes of civil war, not only to save Rome, but to remake it in his image. That is why his name survives, why his reign is studied, while his vision endures. Augustus was not just the man who ruled Rome, who was the architect of Rome's eternity.